Hey everybody. So a few years ago, I was playing around with the HTML dialog element. And real quick, if you're unfamiliar with that, the dialog element is sort of like browser native modals, okay? But yeah, I don't know. Back then, I came away thinking this is very cool, but maybe not quite ready for prime time. But yeah, yesterday it occurred to me, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's old news. Maybe I'm late to the pack and I should be using this right now. And as it turns out, I was right. So I've been researching this quite a bit in the last day, and I'd like to show you every single thing I've learned step by step. Let's get started. Now, I'm going to use the Laracasts source code for our example, and that's a Vue app. But yeah, just keep in mind, all of this can be applied to bread and butter HTML, CSS, and JavaScript projects. All right, so you can see I've set up a simple component here that says begin. And if I view this in the browser, this is what we get. All right, let's get started. Step 1. And let's start very simply. Imagine you have a button that says toggle modal. And real quick, I'll give it a class like button and button blue, just to make it a little prettier. Okay, so as you can imagine, when I click on this button, it should ... toggle a modal. All right, let's create the modal. So we can make use of the dialog element, just like this. All right, so I could say hello from the modal. Now, if I switch back to the browser, though, you'll notice I don't see anything here. And that's because the default display for a dialog element is none. You don't see it unless you activate it. But if you want to force it to be open, you can add the open attribute, just like this. So now we can see it right here. Pretty cool. All right, but let's turn that off. So I have a button. Now I want to toggle the dialog. How do I do that? Well, of course, we need to listen for a click event. So with vanilla JavaScript, you might do something like this, but I'm in a Vue app, so I can say @click, and then I can say onClick or something like that. Okay, now I can define a function to handle that click event. Now, once again, if I were using vanilla JavaScript, I might do something like this. Document.querySelector, look for the dialog, and then I can call a method showModal. All right, that's it. Let's give it a shot. Click on the button. That triggers the click event, and sure enough, we have our modal. Now, it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but that's okay. We can fix that pretty easily with CSS. And even better, a lot is going on here that you may not initially notice. For example, while this dialog is open, notice that if I click around all these buttons, everything is disabled. And yeah, we kind of take that for granted, but if you were manually implementing a modal from scratch, you would have to work on features just like that. All right, second, if I press the escape key, it closes the dialog. And once again, in the past, we had to write up that code manually. So that's very cool. All right, so if I switch back to PHP Storm, yeah, now that you understand the vanilla JS way to go about it, if you don't mind, I want to make use of Vue just a little bit more. So here's what I would normally do in a Vue app. I'd add a ref to the dialog, something like that. And then in order to access that element, I could say let dialog equal a ref, and I'll set that to null. And then I can remove this function call entirely and do it inline. When you click on this button, grab the dialog ref, and that's just giving me a reference to that DOM element. So now directly on that element, once again, I can call showModal. And yeah, that just makes things a little bit cleaner, at least to my eyes. And we'll get the exact same thing, which is cool. All right, let's move on to phase 2. Most of the time, your dialogs will wrap forms, right? So let's try this. Let's create a form, and I'll have a button, once again with a class of button and button blue, and all it says is close. All right, so we have a dialog that simply closes the dialog. So if I click toggle modal, we get our tiny, tiny little modal here. But notice if I click on it, well, you may not notice it in the video, but that's actually refreshing the page. And of course it's doing that. That's the default behavior for a form. It's making a GET request here. But we don't really want that. I'm inside of a dialog. So instead, on the form tag, I can set method to dialog. So when I do this, it's not going to submit to the server. Instead, it's going to close the dialog. It will remember all of the input values, and it will make them available to you when you need them. Okay, so if I come back and try this again, yeah, it's going to look similar to before, but rest assured, it's actually not submitting to the server. It's very snappy. Pretty cool. Okay, but you know what? While we're here, let's take a short break. This is a horrible looking modal, so why don't we write just a little bit of CSS to make it prettier? Now, I'm in a view single file component, so I'm going to place it in the style tag down here. But of course, you can put it in an external CSS file, whatever you want to do. So let's style our dialog, and I'm hoping Copilot can help me out here. All right, let's see. It set a width and height of 100%. Yeah, but why don't we set a maximum width? I'm going to keep it very simple here, but in your projects, you might want to do something like the maximum width can be 80% of the viewport width. That might be a good way to go. For now, though, I will set a maximum width of 500 pixels. We're going to make it a fixed position, and I'll do inset 0, so it goes top, left, right, and bottom of 0. And then for the background color, let's just hard code that to white. All right, let's see how that did. And yeah, here's what we get. All right, let's do a little more. Let's set a border radius, maybe 0.5 rems. Come back, now it's rounded. Next, maybe we don't need to force the height, so I will remove that entirely. And now it'll take up only as much as is necessary. All right, next, why don't we add a little bit of padding all around? All right, and then finally, I don't know, maybe a box shadow. And this is going to be super developer-y. How about 10 pixels of shadow? And yeah, maybe black at 10%. Good enough for me. Find something off the shelf, maybe through Tailwind. That is much better. Now you'll notice that it's perfectly positioned, and that might be because it's inheriting some margin. So notice if I set margin to 0, yeah, and that makes sense. It does push it up to the top left. But yeah, in our case, I do want it vertically and horizontally centered. So I think that makes sense. All right, so now, yeah, if I were to scroll up, we might say, this is pretty cool. And let's start structuring things. Okay, so generally with a modal, right, you have a header and then a main section and then a footer, right? So why don't we do that now? We'll say header. And I don't know, maybe this is a sign up modal or something like that. You'll have a main section. Here are the steps for registration. And then finally, we have a footer, which will usually contain any relevant buttons. And yeah, this is a fairly standard modal layout. So if I come back, here we go. All right, so now I don't want to make you watch this too much, but I will apply some initial styling using Tailwind. And do notice anything unique to the implementation, I will do manually down here just so that it's portable to whatever tool you use. But for anything like setting a color or font weight, I will use utility classes. For example, font bold, and then maybe text 4XL or something like that, or maybe 3XL. And then maybe on the form tag itself, we'll set space Y of 6, just a little bit of breathing room in between all of the elements. And yeah, to be honest, it still doesn't look very good, but that's okay. You can work on this on your own, just like I will. But for now, in this video, we're mostly focused on the implementation. How do we get this thing to work in the first place? Okay, so now notice if I toggle the modal, by default, the dialog element will focus the first focusable element that it comes across, which means if I press the return key, it will hit the close button. And by default, the close button is going to close the dialog, not because it says close, but instead because we set a method of dialog. That's how it works. So notice if I remove this and come back, toggle, if I press return, well, yeah, it closes it, but then it makes a full page refresh like we learned. Okay, so let's bring that back. And to make this a little more clear, what I'll do is say on the button, if you are focused using Tailwind, I can set a ring all the way around it. Now it'll be just a little more clear. And yeah, maybe you can see that. There's a little ring around it because it is the currently focused button. And I'll close that. All right, let's move on to phase 3. So if I toggle the modal, notice that I can still scroll the page behind it. And yeah, if you've ever implemented your own custom modal, you've run into this at some point or another. Maybe that's the functionality you want, but probably not. All right, so how do we disable this? Well, think about it. We know, if I switch back, that on the HTML element, I could set an overflow of hidden, and that would keep me from scrolling, right? So if I come back and refresh the page, toggle the modal, yeah, I'm trying to scroll right now and it's not working. The only problem is even when I close the modal, well, I can't scroll the page and that's not ideal. All right, but maybe we can find a way to say, well, while the dialog is open, then set overflow to hidden. And luckily these days with modern CSS, it turns out that's really simple. I'll show you. I can use a has pseudo class. And this one is so cool. It allows me to style the HTML tag dependent upon its descendants. So for example, if I were to say dialog here, well, now we're saying, all right, set overflow to hidden on the HTML tag if it has dialog as a descendant. But that's not enough. I really want to say if it has a dialog that is currently open. All right, well, remember in the first step, we learned that you could use an open attribute to force the dialog open when the page loads. Well, we can reference that in our selector. I can say dialog open. All right, so now we only set overflow to hidden if the HTML tag has a dialog that is currently in an open state. All right, let's come back to the browser. And yeah, I can scroll the page like normal, but if I toggle the modal, now you can't tell, but I'm trying to scroll that page and it's not working. But as soon as I close it, that selector is no longer applied and we're back to normal. Problem solved. All right, let's move on to phase 4, is it? I want to figure out how we can listen for events. So for example, if I want to know when this dialog has been closed, what would I do? Well, as it turns out, when you close the dialog, it fires a close event. I'll show you. Right down here in our script tag, well, let's wait for the component to mount. And this is just view-specific stuff, so you can ignore it entirely if you want. Just think, when the component is ready to interact with, then run some code. It's sort of like a document.ready for the component. But yeah, again, using vanilla JavaScript, I could say, find the dialog and add an event listener to it. And we learned the event is closed, right? So when it's closed, trigger this callback function. So I can say, I was closed. All right, let's give it a shot. Ooh, event is defined but never used. Yeah, sorry, you can ignore that. Come back, toggle the modal, and when I close it, sure enough, we caught that event and we responded to it. Very cool. But what if I want to fetch a value? For example, often you're building a confirmation modal, right? And maybe the button choices are cancel and continue. So let's implement that. We'll have one that says cancel, and I'll set the value to cancel. And then the other one says continue, or how about proceed? Value is proceed. Okay, well, of course, we need to detect which of these buttons the user pressed, right? And that's going to be stored within the return value of the dialog. I'll show you. Right down here, this time I will accept the event, and then I will alert event.target. So that's going to give me the dialog node, right? And then I'll say, give me the return value. And again, that's going to be equal to one of these values here. Let's give it a shot. All right, so if I press cancel, we see cancel. Or if I press proceed, yeah, now we have a way to proceed based upon which button the user clicked. Now, while we're here, very quickly on the footer, I'm going to add just a little bit of space in between those buttons. Yeah, that was kind of driving me crazy. All right, next, both of these buttons being blue, that's not ideal. So let's change this to button cancel. All right, back to the browser, toggle, and yeah, now I can cancel or proceed. Perfect. So once again, now if I were to switch over to a view-specific implementation, what I might do is on the dialog element, I could listen for a close event, and then once again, call whatever function would be appropriate. I'm just going to call it onClose. And then I can say function onClose, alert the return value. So once again, I could accept the event, or because I already have a reference to the dialog, I could say dialog.value. And again, that's just Vue's way of giving me the HTML dialog node. And then once again, I could say return value on that. So this would be another way to handle this. All right, come back to the browser, toggle the modal, cancel, and yeah, once again, I get the exact same thing. That's just more of a Vue-specific implementation. All right, so what next? What about a backdrop? Typically, when you open a modal, we fade the background in some form. And again, CSS to the rescue. This ends up being pretty easy to accomplish. So let's say right down here, I could say dialog, and I specifically want to style the backdrop. Okay, so just to make this crystal clear, let's make a background of red. And if I switch back and toggle it, yeah, we're sure it's working, but we don't want red. So instead, why don't we do something very, I don't know, super developer-y, like black at 50 alpha. So come back, and now if I toggle it, yeah, just notice the background fades out just a little bit. Okay, but maybe, I don't know, maybe you want to blur the background as well. Well, in those cases, we can use backdrop filter. So why don't we blur it by just a little bit, maybe 5 pixels. Just keep in mind, this is somewhat of a newer property. So if you're writing this all out manually, you might need to apply a vendor prefix. But because I'm using Vue and Vite, that gets handled automatically behind the scenes. Okay, so now, notice the background is quite a bit blurred. So it doesn't take very much at all. Slightly darker and slightly blurred. Looks good to me. All right, let's move on to phase 6, is it? I hope so. I want to animate or transition the modal. What we have here is good for my eyes, but my designer at Laracasts, Adrian, he wouldn't be happy with this. He wants to animate it. He wants to transition and slide it up from the bottom and stuff like that. But right now, you can't. And this had me somewhat stumped. So here's my understanding, and maybe you can help. My understanding is when we toggle the modal, we're just switching it from display none to display fixed or something like that. And as you know, you can't animate a display toggle. So if we want to get around that, as I understand it, and from what I've learned, we basically have to take ownership of the toggle. Something like this. If I go to Dialog, I could say display block. And now, notice we see it, because remember, the default display for the dialog is none. That way you don't see it when the page loads. And actually, real quick, while I'm here, notice I can see through it a little bit. Why don't we set a z-index of something pretty high, because it should usually be on top of the page, like 100. Okay, so now we've taken ownership of the dialog, which means we have to be responsible for showing and hiding it when necessary. Okay, so here's what I have learned through Reddit and Mozilla's website and a few questions on Twitter. Let me know what you think of this. So we could set an opacity of 0, and that will hide the dialog. So it is being rendered, but it's effectively invisible to us, right? Next, we want to set pointer events to none, just in case it would pick anything up. And then what I could say is when the dialog is open, I want to change the styling. For example, opacity 1 and pointer events is auto. So now toggle modal, and it seems like we've re-implemented that functionality. But I don't know, you can tell me. I feel like we're doing something bad here. Is that okay? Is there a performance cost to that? Is there a layout issue related to it? I feel like there must be, but this is the best advice I've come across if we want to animate and transition the modal. Okay, so now let's do that. Now, one thing we could do immediately is set transition to opacity, and I'm going to make it really slow just to make sure you can see it in the video. All right, so toggle modal, and now it fades in over the course of 3 seconds. But check this out. If I click cancel to close it, it's kind of weird, right? And that's because the backdrop was instant. So again, here's a question for you. Is there a way to transition the backdrop? Because my understanding is right now you really can't do it. Maybe in the future we can. But at least at the time of this recording, I don't know how to do it. So maybe you can help me. But that's a bit problematic. I don't like the way that looks. And granted, in real life, it won't be 3 seconds. In real life, I would do probably 0.3 seconds. So it's a little harder to detect. But nonetheless, it's a bit of a problem, and it's something to be aware of. How do you transition the backdrop? All right, next, what if you want to slide it up from the bottom like you see on the Laracasts forum? Well, we'd need to use a custom animation for that. So maybe right down here, I would define some keyframes, and we'll call this slide up. And this is really easy stuff. Start by being effectively invisible, and then I want you to finish by being visible. All right, but next I want to push the element down. So what I could do is say transform, and then translate Y to something tall, like 100% or 100% of the viewport height. That might be too much. I'm not sure. Maybe 100% is enough. Let's do 100% viewport height, though. And then when we're done, that will translate to 0. That's one way that we can handle this. Okay, so now I could say when the dialog is open, apply that animation. Slide up. Again, I'm going to do it very slowly over the course of 3 seconds, and then we'll do something like, I don't know. I'm a developer. I can barely tell the difference. Ease in, out. Let's do both. Okay, so toggle the modal, and now over the course of 3 seconds, very dramatically, it slides in. And then if I press cancel, of course, it fades out. Okay, let's tweak that to be, once again, something pretty fast, maybe 1/3 of a second. And that looks good. Toggle, cancel. All right, so now for phase 7, sometimes I want my modal to take up the full width. I want it to almost be like a page-sized modal, right? So why don't we add a toggle for that? And here's what I'm thinking. Let's stick with a simple class. So if the dialog has a class of full, then it should be treated as a full-sized dialog. Okay, so let's scroll down and tweak it just a little bit. We'll say a dialog that is full, and actually let's change this. Let's make the class full size. Okay, come back down. In these cases, I'm going to change the maximum width. So by default, it's set to 500 pixels, but why don't we change it to 90% of the viewport width? So now if I toggle it, yeah, it takes up much more real estate. Okay, next I'm going to set a height to 100%. Come back, there we go. But in these situations, it becomes instantly clear that our layout isn't quite right. So with that in mind, why don't we say, let's align the header, the main section, and the footer a little better. So the parent is a form. So here's what I'll do. We'll say dialog, if it's full size, grab the form, and I'm going to set a display of grid. Okay, inspect the elements, and yeah, now this is treated as a grid. Okay, so now I'm going to set these rows so that the top and the bottom can be automatically sized, but the middle section should expand as much as needed. So what I can do is say grid template rows to auto, and then 1 fractional unit, and then auto. Finally, I can set a height of 100% on the form as well. Okay, so now, yeah, there we go. So you'll see that, once again, if we inspect this, the main section right here can expand as much as necessary. So if I were to say background of kind of a grayish color, notice it's going to expand for as much room as is available. And then, by the way, what we might want to do is check this out. If I come back into our main section, let's do this. I'm just going to create a bunch of paragraphs temporarily to force some scrolling. And let's have a look at what we have here. All right, toggle the modal. And yeah, we do get some scrolling out of the box natively from the dialog. But notice as I'm scrolling here, I can't see the header or the footer. So what I could do is right down here at the bottom, I could say, all right, dialog, full size, grab the form, and then grab that central div. And we'll set overflow Y to auto. That way, we add scrolling to that main section. Okay, so yeah, now it'll scroll quite a bit, but I can still see the header and the footer. And most of the time, that's going to be what you want. Cool. But yeah, let's come back and clean this up. All right, so now for our final phase, we're going to focus specifically on Vue and how we can organize and componentize much of what we've built here. So I'll tell you what, if you're not interested in Vue at all, you're done. Bye. I'll see you later. But yeah, otherwise, if you want to figure out how you can make things a little bit more flexible and reusable, stick around. So the first thing I would do here is extract a dedicated dialog component. If I open up my sidebar, here's my project here, and I already have a folder called Dialogs. So I'm going to create a new Vue component here called Dialog, and I'm not going to use TypeScript. But if I bring back our demo project here, yeah, at least to start, I'm going to copy the whole thing, cut it, and move it into the template tag here. All right, next, I'll do the exact same thing for all of the styling. So let's cut that and move it in here. Okay, so I'm just trying to isolate everything related to a dialog inside of this one component. All right, next, of course, we don't want to hard code any of this. And this is more like the wrapper for any dialog that we create in the future. So for example, maybe we could have a dialog for signing up. So I'd create a new Vue component called sign up dialog. All right, so this would pull in our dialog component. And then once again, yeah, let's come back to dialog and extract some of this. So we have a couple choices here. we could take the whole thing, turn this into a slot, and then paste it in here. But one issue with this is if you want things to be consistent, well, now every single child dialog has to either copy and paste this or retype it up, right? And yeah, you're just introducing the possibility for things to become inconsistent. So with that in mind, why don't we extract further components so that we can reuse each individual piece? For example, this could be the dialog title, something like that. So let's create a new view component here, dialog title, and I'll paste this in, and this will be our slot. Yeah, we're just allowing for reusable HTML at this point. All right, let's switch back. So this will say sign up. Next, I will import that. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing for the footer. So let's duplicate this, and this will be dialog footer. And then, yeah, once again, I will paste in the footer. But of course, the individual buttons will be unique to each component. So once again, I can use a slot there. OK, so let's swap this out with dialog footer. All right, and once again, I will import that. And yeah, I'll leave it at that, but maybe in the future, if your main section also has some unique styling, then you would do something like dialog main. And that way, every individual component can reference these to ensure that everything is as consistent as possible. Okay, what else? Let's go back to our central parent dialog, and you'll see right up here that we are setting the class of full size, but now it sounds like that should be dynamic. So why don't we make that configurable as a prop? We'll say full size is a Boolean, and then I could dynamically apply a class here. So set full size if the full size prop is truthy. And by default, actually, let's tweak this. It's a Boolean, but by default, it's set to false. All right, next I can remove that close event. I can hide the style tag, and this is basically what we have here. I think we can even get rid of the ref as well. So yeah, the dialog component actually is incredibly simple. I like it. All right, so now back to our sign up dialog. We pull in our parent, and then we nest our form. All right, so now we can return to our entry point, that index test view that we've been working with the whole video. And let's play around some. I'm going to reference our sign up dialog. And if we're starting from scratch, this is what we have. All right, so we have a button, and then we have a sign up dialog. So if I come back and inspect this, sure enough, we have our button and our dialog that is currently hidden. Okay, so as we've learned, we could add a ref to our component here. Again, call it dialog. So set dialog equal an empty ref. Okay, so now we have access to that DOM element. And then I could say, when you click on me, refs.dialog. And yeah, how do we want to do this? Maybe we can expose a method called show on the signup modal. That might be helpful. Or we could just do a manual query selector if we want. That's the cool thing. We could just say document.querySelector signup_dialog.showModal, and that would work as well. But we want the API to be nice and friendly, so maybe we have a method called show. All right, so if I open up signup, oh, and by the way, I got this wrong, dialogs, that's signup dialog. Anyways, if I open up this component now, yeah, we need to expose a function. So function show, and just to show you how this works, we'll say time to show the dialog. But just creating the function won't expose it to the outside world, so to speak. So what I could do is say define expose show. Okay, so now we can access it outside of the component. It's pretty cool. All right, let's give it a shot. Toggle the modal and time to show the dialog. So we are able to call a function on a child component from a parent. So yeah, maybe what we could do is apply an ID, like sign up dialog. And then right here, yeah, again, if you just want to do a simple document.querySelector, you could say sign up dialog.showModal. Come back, toggle the modal, and now it's working just like it did before. Cancel. But now we're in this boat where every single child modal would need to re-implement some of this functionality. And we don't want to do that. So in situations like this, We could delegate to the parent. We could use a prop. We could use a composable. Why don't we do a composable just to demonstrate how that might work? So in my composables directory, I'm going to create a new JavaScript file, and we'll call it use dialog. All right, so now I could export a function, and by tradition, we give the name of the function the same name as the file name. And yeah, all I'm going to do here is return two simple methods like show and close. All right, so yeah, maybe we accept a selector like this, and then we could say document.query selector.showModal. And then for close, yeah, we could do the exact same thing. Just swap it out with close. Very, very simple. We're just extracting two basic functions. But now we don't have to rewrite them for every new dialog component that we create. All right, so if I switch back here, yeah, now I could remove this and instead import use dialog. I could call the function, and that's going to, of course, return an object containing two methods. So I will destructure them like this. Let show close equal use dialog. And then I will expose those to the outside world. That way the parent can call a show or a close method on this individual component if it wants to. I'll show you. If we come back to our index view, this should just work out of the box. Oh, and it doesn't. You know, anytime you get a little bit cocky, that's when it lets you know it doesn't work. Cannot read property of null reading show modal on use dialog. What did I do wrong? Oh yeah, of course, this would make sense. So we're trying to call a show method here, but I didn't provide the selector. So I would have to do this sign up dialog, and does that fix it? Yes, it does. But now I have to know what the ID is for the component there. And yeah, again, that just makes for a crappy API. So let's see if we could instantiate it here. So we define the ID on this component. So let's pass it here as a selector. And then it will be received here. So why don't we say base selector? And if you override that selector when you call one of these methods, we'll use your selector. But otherwise, we will default to the base. I don't know, is that weird? Maybe we don't have to do that, but I'm gonna do that for now. Okay, and I think that should do the trick. So if I come back, yeah, it works just like it did before. But now, yeah, at this point, we're just trying to make the API as simple as possible to use. If I have a button and I want to show a dialog, then I just add a ref, and then I call show on that ref. All right, and that's mostly it. I think we're in pretty good shape here. So now in our signup dialog, you have your form, and you can proceed however you normally would, right? You'd say submit equals on submit. You gather your data, you make your AJAX request, and you're all set to go. And further, because we've componentized some of these individual pieces, like the dialog title, well, now if we decide, there should probably be a little close button in the top right, which is pretty standard, right? Well, we can do it right here on dialog title, and then, of course, that will be reflected everywhere in our project that we reference a dialog title. So yeah, maybe right here, we'd have a button with some kind of fancy X to close it, and now we can see it here. Okay, so at this point we could say maybe flex, justify between, items start. Yep. Then on the button, font bold, text large. And then, well, we have no styles here. But then when you click on it, well, we don't have access to the component at this point. So maybe you could emit an event, like click, and let's emit a close event or something like that. And then we can push it up a level. All right, define emit, close, or just emit. So now back to sign up dialog. Yeah, this would just be one way to do it. Another way would be to pass a prop to handle the logic. But yeah, we could say on close, then call this close method, and that would work as well. Toggle the modal, we click our ugly close button, and yeah, it works just fine. All right, so what was that, 8 or 9 different phases? That's pretty cool. I hope you learned a bit, and I hope you enjoyed it. But keep in mind, I'm still learning myself, so let me know, what did I miss here? What am I not thinking about? Is the way that we animate the modal, is that smart, or is that idiotic. It could be either. I could go both ways on that one, and I'd love to hear what you think. All right, my name's Jeffrey Way. I'll see you next time.